welcome to the conference championship round of the Pro Football Focus Chalk Talk podcast. This is potentially our last podcast of the season. We might do another one for the Pro Bowl, Super Bowl slate. We shall see. But we have Tyler Buecher back with us. Finally, it was a weird week without him. But shout out to Tyler Lochner for filling in admirably. Tyler, this is just a measly two-game slate. How are you approaching it?
I just want to say thanks to Tyler, first of all, for filling in last week. Did a great job. You guys brought the heat, and it was a great listen. But as far as this week, man, it's just 2 weeks. We've got backup quarterbacks going against some great defenses, and then we've got the GOAT quarterback going against the GOAT defense. It's a tough one. Ownership, leaving money on the table, finding the right chalk to fade. There's a lot of interesting things we're going to think about when constructing lineups this week, and it's really tough for a two-game slate.
I'm with you. Remember the importance of two things. One, you must late swap. If you have any New England or Jacksonville players that just completely busted, your lineup's not looking too good. By all means, you have everything to gain and nothing to lose by pivoting to some more controversial, likely lower-owned, high upside plays. Ben Roethlisberger was actually the quarterback that I settled on last week. He's either going to throw for 5 interceptions or just go nuclear with 5 touchdowns, 400 yards. Didn't actually think he'd have his second best fantasy game ever, but that was pretty interesting. But a lot of people had what they viewed as dead lineups, so they just pivoted to a Steelers onslaught lineup and then made a ton of money from it. So yeah, definitely keep your eye on late swap. That's super important. Also, just note our player pool has shrunk significantly on this two-game slate. So we're going to be rostering some ugly, very cheap guys, like even Mercedes Lewis. I'll project Mercedes Lewis for like 3 fantasy points, but there's still an argument to make to roster him potentially like on DraftKings where he's 2,500, just because that salary relief might make your team better everywhere else to the point where his low output's not going to hurt you too much. That's a lot of digression, and I know we've covered that before. So, Tyler, let's just dig right into this thing and look at let's start with the New England Patriots, who are at home against the Jacksonville Jaguars. They're favored by 9 points, about a 28-point implied point total. And the first thing that stands out to me is I think we've learned by now that Bill Belichick is the best coach in the NFL, maybe the history of the NFL, and he has the same strategy every week, even though that it changes every week. The strategy is the same. Attack your opposition where they are weakest, avoid their greatest strengths. And to me, that is avoid A.J. Bouye, avoid Jalen Ramsey, get the ball out as quickly as possible. I think you're going to see the running backs on the field quite a bit. Jacksonville's a lot weaker to running backs to help create mismatches. For also Rob Gronkowski, we saw Jesse James have a big game last week. So I'm a little lower on the wide receivers, higher on the running backs, still like Brady, and obviously Gronk is probably going to smash. But Tyler, what are your thoughts on New England as a whole, and then where do you stand on Brady?
Yeah, I agree with you that we're going to see the best way for them to attack them is via running the ball and throwing quick passes, design passes to the running backs, to the tight end, things over the middle of the field just to get this offense moving and away from the perimeter. I agree wholeheartedly that I think the running back position is a key one for us to analyze here this week for the Patriots. Tom Brady as well. I mean, it's a tough task for him going against this historically great pass defense of the Jaguars. However, like you mentioned, the Patriots are implied for a team total of 27.75 points, highest on the slate by a wide margin. And Brady easily carries the highest floor and the highest ceiling of any of the quarterbacks playing this weekend. Not much competition there for him. But that being said, he's going to have a lot of ownership as well. We know Belichick will be doing as much film review as possible to see where Big Ben and Jimmy Garoppolo were able to succeed against this Jacksonville defense. Both those guys threw for a ton of yardage and touchdowns. Won't be shocked at all to see them try to mimic how those two teams played the Jaguars. I don't know. I don't really think there's a lot of analysis needed for Brady. He's the best play on the board. The only thing you're really looking at is fading it from an ownership perspective. But I could see Brady checking down to a lot of his running backs and tight ends, and that's primarily how I'll be stacking this game.
Right, I'm with you. But you said you think New England goes run heavy, and what's having you lean that direction? Is it the spread, the 9-point spread? Because that is big.
It is big, and it's also just their weakness. I mean, this has been one of the best pass defenses we've seen in years, and I don't know, it just reminds me of that Le'Veon Bell Week 5 performance where they decided to have Big Ben drop back and throw it 50 times instead of relying on the run when this run defense can be had. Granted, the return of Marcel Darius has improved it quite significantly, but I still think that's the best way to attack this team.
I still think this is a top 5 run defense in the NFL since trading for Marcel Darius in Week 9. The ranked 4th best in yards per carry allowed. I know even before that, a lot of that was due to a few really big runs that killed him in the first few weeks of the season. But I like Brady a lot. Like you said, he's going to be highly owned. He's the most expensive quarterback. But he's going to be the top quarterback in your projection, so just know that too. The running backs. So this is interesting to me. Jacksonville ranks 5th best in opposing passer rating to slot wide receivers, best to outside wide receivers, top 10 to tight ends. But they rank 8th worst in opposing passer rating when quarterbacks are targeting running backs against Jacksonville. I think that's what we're going to see a lot from Brady. Dion Lewis saw 15 carries and 10 targets last week. James White saw 4 and 7. White found the end zone twice, not too much yardage, while the opposite was true for Lewis, who totaled 141 yards and didn't score. He had the highest expected fantasy point total of all running backs last week, about double White. If Rex Burkhead returns, and that looks likely, it's going to make the other two more risky, as well as Burkhead. And I'll probably mix and match exposure to White and Burkhead. A few minor shots, but Lewis is definitely the guy who stands out to me as one of my favorite plays. What do you think?
I agree 100%. I think it's trending more and more likely that Burkhead's playing, but the return of him will just limit the ceiling of Lewis, unfortunately. When Burkhead was active, Lewis never saw more than 15 carries in a game, and just puts a huge hamper on his potential. Lewis was averaging 28.3 touches over his past 3 outings, so to see him go down to maybe, probably 15 to 18 touches, I think that's kind of reasonable. Maybe see Burkhead 10 to 15 and White for 5 to 8. It just kind of spreads it around and makes them a much better real-life play than DFS. It's going to be tough, but like we said, they're huge home favorites. They should see a lot of carries. They're going to be attacking the ball via the pass with the backs as well. They're all really good plays. I think it's worth getting some exposure to all of them. But it'll be, if you're to prioritize it, it has to be Lewis, Burkhead, White.
Moving on to the wide receiver position, I could see a lot of people get excited about Danny Amendola. He just had 11 catches for 112 yards against Tennessee, led the team in targets. But Jacksonville's has been just as stout to slot wide receivers as they have to outside wide receivers, slot wide receivers. They're allowing the fewest fantasy points per game to slot wide receivers as they are to also outside wide receivers. Tennessee ranked 14th worst this season. Cooks and Hogan both failed to top 35 yards last week. I'd expect something similar again. Boye, Jalen Ramsey putting together this historic cornerback tandem season. I like Cooks maybe the most. I could see Brady doing one of those patented jet pop passes where he just kind of runs it into the end zone from the 5-yard line, and it's barely a pass, but it'll count. Could see him scoring on that. Really not too interested about any of the wide receivers. What about you?
Yeah, I just kind of want to echo it. I kind of agree with you there. Amendola, I mean, I think a lot of people are going to be chasing last week's production, but Jacksonville has allowed the fewest fantasy points to opposing slot receivers this year. Aaron Colvin, their slot cornerback, has allowed 0.85 yards per route covered. That leads all cornerbacks on the slate. That's better than his teammates A.J. Boye and Jalen Ramsey. If Amendola were to see targets, he'll likely be caught at the point of attack with little room to pick up any kind of yardage after the catch. Colvin's been great in tight defense. I just think Amendola is an easy fade for me here, where we're going to see a lot of people go to him. One argument I will make is I kind of like Cooks in GPPs. He always has that massive ceiling where he could go for a long touchdown, and we've seen these kind of skinny speedster receivers give Jacksonville fits. Tyler Lockett ran for a 74-yard touchdown earlier this year. Paul Richardson, 66 yards. Jerron Brown, 61. T.Y. Hilton, 40 yards. All these guys, 40 or plus more yards. A.J. Boye ran a 4.55 at his pro day at Central Florida. Granted, that was 2013. It was also a pro day, so take it with a grain of salt. But we know that Cooks is the type of burner receiver that just can absolutely feast on these slower corners. I just think he's a great GPP play, while others are looking at Amendola. I'd rather spend up another $600 and get to Cooks.
Yeah, I will say, it is Tom Brady. Brandon Cooks, Chris Hogan saw a significant price reduction. I guess always in play for that reason. I'm not really too on it. And Boye has been good deep this season. Though I know there is a big difference in speed. I'm not sure. And that has mattered for Cooks. Boye has been good deep the past 2 seasons. As has Ramsey. But Vance McDonald last week, the Steelers tight end, he led the team in receptions. He went over 100 receiving yards. I still think Jacksonville is one of the toughest teams in the league against tight ends. But they're so strong against wide receivers that I think this will still funnel some targets to Rob Gronkowski, who is matchup proof anyway. He averages 21.7 fantasy points per game across his last 6 postseason games. I know he's going to be massively, massively owned, but I don't think I'm going to fade it on like almost any lineup and just go all in Gronkowski and see what I could do.
Yeah, I love that move. All in on Gronk and then adding another tight end in the flex if you're interested in doing that. But it's just so hard to fade Gronk when you just see he's got such a great matchup here. They've been using Miles Jack, their middle linebacker, for much of the season to handle the tight end assignment, and it really hasn't been great for him. On 27 targets, Jack has allowed a 77.8% completion percentage and a 138.9 passer rating when covering tight ends. Gronk should absolutely demolish Jack. It's been so bad that I've even heard there's been talk of moving Jalen Ramsey to cover Gronk. What do you think about that potential? We have yet to see it, but it kind of makes sense to use your best weapon, who's got size, physicality, and just the wherewithal to keep up with someone like Gronk. I don't know if we'll actually see that, but I just heard talk about it.
Could be. That would be really fun to watch at the very worst. I do know that Gronkowski averages 9.8 yards per target against cornerbacks, 11.0 against linebackers, and 9.5 against safeties. So maybe that makes more sense than anything else, but don't have too much to analyze outside of that. Would be a fun thing to watch. Moving on to the Jaguars side of the ball, they're on the road. They're underdogs by 9, about an 18.75 implied point total. We think that Belichick will avoid Jacksonville's shutdown cornerbacks and instead attack with the running backs through the air and the tight ends. And I think it's fairly obvious what they're going to do against Jacksonville's offense. They're going to try and stop their greatest strengths and, devote a little less attention to their bigger weaknesses, try and exploit those. And I think in this case, it's what every defense has done against Jacksonville this year. They're going to stack the box against Leonard Fournette and try to force Blake Bortles to beat them via the pass. It makes sense to do that last week as well. Tennessee was the league's 7th most run-heavy offense. What did they do? Tennessee running backs had just 12 carries for 28 rushing yards. Marcus Mariota threw 37 times, 250-plus yards, 2 touchdowns, 0 interceptions. While Jacksonville is the most run-heavy team in the league this year, I like Blake Bortles a lot. Just as a strong value, as a contrarian play, not a people are going to be on. He's hit at least 16 fantasy points in 10 of his last 12 games. Averages 17.7 over that stretch. That would be the 9th most by any quarterback this season, if over a full season. The data is also backing up the matchup for Bortles. New England ranks 8th worst in schedule-adjusted fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks. Their efficiency is good everywhere else. It's just the lead by so much that it gives the opposition a lot of dropbacks, a lot of opportunities to put up points. I will also say that I think with the spread in mind, remember 9-point underdogs, we could see some vintage 2015 garbage time hero Blake Bortles, maybe play poorly but still have a big day for fantasy. What do you think, Tyler?
Yeah, I agree with you a lot. I think Bortles is a strong play this week. We saw him score at least 20-plus fantasy points in 4 of the final 6 games to end the regular season. He's got a multi-touchdown ceiling. He's got rushing potential, as we saw in that crazy wild card game where he ran for more than he threw. Really wouldn't be surprising at all to see Bortles pick up some decent rushing production this week, especially in garbage time. There's also a case here for an uptick in projected pace for both teams, as both teams finished top 5 in snaps per game during the regular season. The only thing I'm worried about Bortles is the possibility of Fournette stealing red zone work, stealing some touchdowns there. But I still think Bortles is a strong play. He's got some receivers that are in some interesting spots, but I think given the game script, he's going to be throwing or running. Honestly, he's probably the number 2 play behind Brady.
Right, and if you factor in ownership and price, it's even closer than that, and maybe Bortles is the superior play, but I do like him a lot. Fournette on the other side of the ball, I do think he's going to have a tough matchup. I think New England's going to stack the box. I think there's going to be poor game script, but I'm still actually fairly high on him. New England ranks 2nd worst in yards per carry allowed. They're surrendering the 7th most receiving fantasy points per game to enemy running backs. Volume's been excellent. He's seen nearly all of the team's work near the end zone. He's averaging 21 carries, 4.5 targets, 0.81 expected touchdowns per game over his last 6 games. Also playing on 74% of the snaps over the stretch, with a lot of these games being losses. So maybe Yeldon's not even in play as a punt play option, and negative game script won't hurt him too much. I don't know. Where do you stand?
Yeah, he's my number 1 running back. I just think he's arguably the safest back that we can project from a touch perspective. Penciling him in for 18 to 20 carries, 3 to 5 targets. I don't think that's outlandish at all, and this game plan will focus primarily on ball control for the Jaguars. They don't want this game to get out of hand where they see some early first half turnovers by Bortles. They'd rather run the ball, keep it under control, and try to slow it down. That's my guess. New England's run defense, they've allowed the 2nd highest yards per carry on the season, but they've seen that turn around quite recently. Over the last 3 games, they've turned that down to just 2.7 yards per carry, and that's while facing some pretty good backs in Derrick Henry, Bilal Powell, LaShawn McCoy. So there is some concern for Fournette's actual production, but like the volume, like he's the only back here that's not in a timeshare. He's going to see a ton of snaps, a ton of touches, and his price tag isn't enough where there's a reason to fade him.
I actually think I like Dion Lewis a little bit more, but I'll agree it's definitely close. Moving on to the wide receivers, this is a little trickier to peg down, expected volume and production. So 2 weeks ago, Dede Westbrook saw 8 targets. No other wide receiver saw more than 1. To be fair, Marquise Lee was limited in this contest. Last week, Lee saw 6 targets. Westbrook saw 3. No other wide receiver saw more than 2. I think that's how the order is going to go this week. Lee sees the most targets, Westbrook second most. But like you said, probably going to be trailing, fast pace. So we should also expect more pass attempts in general, more potential for production. So these two are the volume leaders, Westbrook and Lee, also leading in snaps. Matchup, just average. New England ranks 16th in fantasy points per game allowed to outside wide receivers. But Allen Hurns runs 73% of his routes from the slot, and he's going to draw Eric Rowe, one of our worst-rated cornerbacks this season. New England's allowed the most fantasy points per game to slot wide receivers this season. I want to like him, but end of the day, he's probably still just a punt play. He's seen 3 targets over the last 2 weeks. He's in play, not a great play, and I do like the other two. I think Lee is super cheap on one of the sites.
Yeah, I agree with you there. I think those are the guys that you'd probably want to target, Lee and Westbrook. The thing that does concern me, though, is Stephon Gilmore. He's our number 12 graded cornerback on the year. He's done a really great job shadowing whenever he's been tasked to do that, shutting down receivers of all different sizes and speeds. So I think it'll be a really good matchup to watch with him and Lee. But honestly, I think I'd probably prefer to go to Westbrook here and against Malcolm Butler. They're similarly priced, Westbrook and Lee, but Westbrook just has that big play ability. I mean, we haven't really seen it. What looked like a promising preseason for Westbrook has kind of slowed down due to injuries, and he and Bortles have yet to really show that rapport that we've kind of been searching for. But I think these are the 2 receivers that I'll be narrowing down for the Jaguars, Lee and Westbrook.
Right, and remember wide receivers with high ankle sprains, it usually takes them a good amount of time before they're back on track 100%. So I agree, it's close between Westbrook and Lee. I think I do like Lee a little bit more, though. Mercedes Lewis, he's averaging 4.2 fantasy points per game since week 4, the historic Maurice Jones-Drew week. He's not in play as on paper, viable option, but at the end of the day, he's 2,500. If you could make a stacked lineup with him in the flex, Gronk at the tight end spot, and then just load up, pay up everywhere else, and you think that lineup's better than the others, by all means. I'm probably not going that route, but have fun with it.
Yeah, we've seen over the past few weeks that all 3 of these Jaguar tight ends, Lewis, Ben Koyak, James O'Shaughnessy, they're all like seeing some snaps, but none of them are running enough routes to really quantify any kind of fantasy production beyond a dart throw. Lewis has seen the most snaps, but 80+% both the wild card and the divisional rounds, but he's just been largely used as a blocker. He has the fewest receiving yards of the bunch, actually. Koyak ran 4 and 6 routes the past 2 weeks. O'Shaughnessy ran 12 and 8. The Patriots haven't allowed a tight end to score on them since week 6. I think there's a lot better ways to go to try to save money rather than dumpster diving here with the Jacksonville tight end.
Boom, and there you have it. Definitely not going that route. Thank you, Tyler. Let's move on to your hometown Philadelphia Eagles. They're at home. They are underdogs by 3. Nice little, probably lowest of the slate, implied point total of 17.75. Minnesota's just been right up there with Jacksonville as the best defense in the league. They rank 3rd best in its schedule-adjusted fantasy points per game to quarterbacks. That's going to be rough for Nick Foles. Best to running backs. That's going to be rough to Jay Ajayi and company. They rank best in fantasy points per dropback allowed, 3rd best in opposing passer rating, 6th best in yards per carry. So it's almost equally strong against the pass and the run. Meanwhile, Nick Foles has been one of our worst-rated quarterbacks this season, even including his monstrous game against the Giants. There's also persistent rumors that he's not over an elbow injury he dealt with this preseason. His stats were better than his grades last week. He completed 23 of 30, no interceptions, 246 yards. Still, in this matchup, I don't really see him being in consideration for me at all.
No, I'll be having one dart throw. So I'm planning on entering the 20 max contest on DraftKings this week, and I have one or two lineups potentially here with Philly onslaughts with Foles at the helm. So the Vikings have allowed 22.5 points per game on the road versus 12.5 at home. So there is the potential for Foles and this offense to actually put up some points. I just don't really know if Foles would be the way to do it. However, we've seen all year suboptimal plays have taken down tournaments and GPPs. Why not see it one more time prior to the Super Bowl with Foles?
All right.
That's really bad analysis. I'll admit that.
It's a suboptimal play. Is accurate analysis, but yeah, on this 2-game slate, who knows what could happen? Maybe if you want to take a dart throw, you're an Eagles homer, by all means. I feel similarly about Jay Ajayi. You know, the talent's there. The efficiency over the past 2 seasons clearly there, one of our top 5 running backs by any metric you want to look at. Maybe still a little too expensive based on projected volume. Played on only 46% of the snaps last week. LeGarrette Blount played on 31%. That makes no sense to anyone who's watched any of the games. Maybe Doug Peterson finally comes to his senses, but that's not something I'm willing to put my money on when we have this larger sample suggesting otherwise. He should still get like 15 carries and 4 targets, which is pretty good. Maybe just 10 carries, 0 targets for Blount, 2 to 3 carries and targets for Corey Clement. Like I said, he's talented. This is a top 5 run blocking unit in the NFL. He could go off, he could score, but he's probably not someone I'm going to have on too many of my lineups.
Yeah, I agree with those projections you gave for the backfield. I think that's pretty accurate assessment of what we can expect here. And like you said, anybody that watched him last week against the Falcons, he looked nearly unstoppable for several drives just before the coaches just decided to opt out and go to the other backs. He's facing an adept run defense here this week. They're tops and fewest fantasy points allowed to opposing backs. I don't know. I'm imagining Peterson becomes a little less cute. He realizes that the Vikings defense is really good at taking away the short to intermediate passing area. They're really good at defending the middle of the field as well. So I feel like if I were the Eagles, I would plan on running with Ajayi a lot this week. But again, you never know what coaches are going to do.
Right. Looking at the wide receiver position, I think Alshon Jeffrey is going to draw shadow coverage from Xavier Rhodes. Xavier Rhodes has been one of the best shutdown shadow cornerbacks in the league this season. So he shadowed Antonio Brown, Mike Evans, Marvin Jones twice, Devontae Adams, Josh Doxson, Julio Jones, Devin Funchess, AJ Green, Dontrell Inman, Michael Thomas. Only twice over that span has a wide receiver scored double-digit fantasy points in 2 Rhodes' coverage. Make matters worse, Alshon Jeffrey is also 3rd on the totem pole in terms of targets with Nick Foles under center. Nelson Aguilar seen a much better workload, about 21% of Nick Foles' pass attempts, but he's going to have a tough matchup. Minnesota's allowing the 8th fewest fantasy points per game to slot wide receivers. Aguilar runs 86% of his routes in the slot. Definitely a much better play than Alshon Jeffrey, whether you want to look at it in terms of raw production or volume or matchup. But it's a tough matchup. But just note, he's still in play as a bet on volume and he's been hyper efficient this season, even in tough matchups before. The best matchup for the wide receivers is easily Torrey Smith. He's going to draw Trey Waynes, a guy we've picked on quite a bit this season, especially early on. He ranks bottom 25 in fantasy points per route, fantasy points per target. But Smith really hasn't seen good volume at all with Foles. Foles has attempted 120 passes this season. Smith's accounted for just 15 of those. He's a punt play option.
Yeah, I don't really have much more to add. Alshon Jeffrey, we've seen Xavier Rhodes eliminate opposing top wideouts. Nelson Aguilar, tough outing here against the middle of the field. Terrence Newman just never seems to get older. He's found the fountain of youth there in Minnesota. He's yielded the fourth lowest passer rating when targeted against among all slot corners this year. I'm going to look elsewhere rather than this Philly passing attack. But I will say, when we talked about pivots earlier, Torrey is one of those guys that I think you should keep on your radar as a potential guy that nobody will want to roster, but he could be a potential bailout.
Great idea. Maybe 1% Mac Hollins now. No,
maybe. He had one catch last week. We'll see.
Probably not. Yeah, but just know Torrey Smith, decent GPP dart throw on lineups drawing dead. Tyler, I think I'm just gonna go all in on flexing tight ends this week on DraftKings. Just note when I say this, like I'm not super confident. I'm probably gonna spend the next day just like building lineups and trying to find one I like the most. But right as it stands, I like Zach Ertz a lot. I think he's being overlooked, neglected, and unjustly so. So the matchup's tough. Minnesota ranks 7th best in schedule-adjusted fantasy points per game to tight ends. But remember, the wide receivers are all in tough matchups as well. And Ertz is seeing the best volume with Foles. So per 4 quarters in Foles starts, he leads the team in targets per 4 quarters, remember. 8.6, fantasy points 13.9. Definitely doesn't have the ceiling he had with Carson Wentz, but I think he's intriguing.
I think he's more than intriguing. He's definitely in play for me.
Yes.
In the 3 full games we've seen Foles and Ertz play together, that's excluding Week 17, he's averaged 9.3 targets per game, 1.94 yards per route run. Ertz averaged 1.96 yards per route run from weeks 1 through 13 with Carson Wentz at the helm. So basically with Wentz and Foles at quarterback, Ertz's role hasn't changed whatsoever in this offense. I still think he's a very strong play. Yeah, it's a difficult matchup here against the Vikings, but we've got a short slate, very few options that we actually like to play. So we're just going to be chasing volume here. Only 3 tight ends have managed to score on these Vikings here. 4 have managed to score double-digit fantasy points. It's tough. It's really tough for you to make a strong case for Ertz, but I just think, I don't know, he's the best passing route for this attack if they're going to need to move the ball. We eliminated all the wide receivers. None of them are especially standout plays where we can project them for significant volume. The running backs interchange too much to project anything beyond more than, 4 to 5 catches seems aggressive for a running back projection there for the Eagles. So I'd say 8 to 10 targets for Ertz sounds doable this week.
I'm glad you're on Team Ertz with me this week. I also kind of like the tight ends on the other side of the ball too. I think a lot of people are going to overlook him. But let's hear your case for Mr. Case himself, Case Keenum. Oh, that was terrible.
Look at that. That was nice. So Keenum is the classic case where we like his weapons. We should probably look at the quarterback who's delivering the ball as well. Philadelphia's pass defense hasn't really been something we've targeted this season. They ranked top 12 in fewest fantasy points to the position and top 12 in lowest passer rating to the position. But on a short slate like this, we're going to have to overlook some of these things. Eagles opponents have passed on them a league high 65.5% of the time. 6 different quarterbacks have come away with 20-plus DraftKings points against them during the regular season. Keenum has hit that mark just once in his last 6 games, but he still averaged 16.4 points during that span. Not bad, not terrible. Definitely something that you can get by. So what I like about Keenum is he's probably going to be the 3rd highest owned quarterback of this week. If we could project the Patriots and Jaguars turning to their running backs in the red zone, perhaps we find Keenum escaping here with 2 passing touchdowns, and we see Brady and Bortles just with 1 as they go with Fournette and Lewis or Burkhead to score. Maybe Keenum ends up being the highest scoring quarterback just solely based on, the pass funnel defense of this Eagles defense. They're going to make you pass on them as opposed to run. I think Keenum's a pretty good play this week.
Yeah, so what's interesting is that the Eagles are definitely being passed on at the highest rate in the league. That's 65.4%. We talked about New England, how they just saw a lot of dropbacks against them because they were so frequently leading by so much. Also, high pace of play. But Philadelphia is being passed on even more frequently than New England, but their numbers look way better. They're 9th best in opposing passer rating, 12th best in schedule-adjusted fantasy points per game. So just note that the efficiency has been there for Philadelphia's defense, even more so than New England. It's a large portion of that is because they're so good against the run. They're the only defense to surrender under 1,000 rushing yards this season. They rank 3rd best in yards per carry allowed. Granted, these numbers these numbers do look a little different with Foles under center. The pass rate drops to 60.7%. Yards per carry allowed increased from 3.37 to 3.96. So I do think Minnesota will be able to run on Philadelphia a little bit more successfully than other offenses have earlier in the season. Just looking at Philadelphia's strengths and weaknesses against running backs, you'd make the case for Jerick McKinnon as the better value, just per dollar value, because Philadelphia ranked 1st in rushing fantasy points per game allowed to running backs, but 14th worst to receiving fantasy points allowed to running backs. And we know McKinnon's the superior receiver, but if you want to look at likely game script, remember the Vikings, though away, are favored by 3. They have the second highest implied point total of the slate. I think this pushes things back up for Murray. So since the bye, Murray averages 0.88 expected touchdowns per game. McKinnon averages 0.29. Murray averages 17.4 carries per game. McKinnon 9.9. The difference in McKinnon's favor is targets. He's saying 3.7 targets to Murray's 1.4. And really, we haven't seen Minnesota trail at all this season. Just 23% of the time Minnesota has trailed in their games. I think that's the second or third highest rate in the league this season, or lowest rate, sorry. So just know that if, the Eagles can hold a lead, the spread's only within 3, though not in their favor. McKinnon could prove to be the better value, but really, I do think Latavius is the better option. Tyler, your thoughts?
I'll disagree with you on that one. I think McKinnon's the way I'd like to go. Like you said, the Eagles have allowed the fewest rushing yards. They've allowed the 3rd fewest rushing touchdowns in the league this season. Minnesota's a heavy run game. They're 47.1% of their plays. That's the 4th highest rate in the league. That's going to have some tough sledding against Philadelphia's defensive line, who's been playing lights out. The Eagles ranked 11th in most receptions allowed to opposing backs on the year. I think that's just a clear path for McKinnon here to pick up some fantasy points. Philadelphia has allowed at least 4 receptions 11 different times this season to opposing backs. At small slate, we're going to find players we don't normally target, and McKinnon falls into this category for me here. I think Murray might be a fade for me here, given the Eagles' strong run defense and a little room they allow along their defensive front.
Yeah, I mean, you're making good points. I will just say I think even relative to salary, I do think Murray has the much better workload again since the bye. He's averaging like 4 points more per game in expected fantasy points. And I do think this defense looks a little different with the quarterback change. Less ferocious, more of a reason to go run heavy. Less likely the Eagles are going to be leading or leading by a lot. But I think it is a debate and a fairly close call, which either way you go. Talking about close calls, I don't know if it gets much closer than Stephon Diggs or Adam Thielen. Tyler, where do you stand on this one?
The answer is both. I think I'm going to jam in these guys into most of my lineups just because you have so much salary available to you this week. We don't have the Antonio Browns or Le'Veon Bells that soak up 10K or 9.6K or whatever. We have these 7.4 for Adam Thielen, 6.9 for Stephon Diggs on DraftKings. I think both their prices make them affordable, and I really like the matchups here for both. Um, for Thielen, we saw him run a season low 28% of his routes from the slot last week in the divisional round. That's especially noteworthy considering he ran most of his routes from the slot for much of the regular season. And it opens up some questions. Are they going to repeat this feat here against the Eagles? If so, that would mean Thielen would avoid Patrick Robinson, who's our number 6 graded cornerback on the year. The Eagles have some questionable corners on the outside with Jalen Mills, a guy that we've targeted for much of the year, and Ronald Darby. He's been pretty good when he's in there, but he spent much of the time this season being injured and out of the lineup. However, the Eagles rank top 10 in most receptions and top 10 in most receiving yards allowed to opposing wideouts. They're allowing a ton of work that way, so I really like the idea of playing Thielen and Diggs together. Jalen Mills, no cornerback allowed more touchdowns than Mills this season with 9. He's been a guy we've targeted all year on this pod, and I'm not going to stop now. Diggs finished the year as our number 8 wide receiver. He was number 1 in contested catch rate. He's caught 85.7% of his targets when thrown to in the red zone, finishing with 7 red zone touchdowns on the year. He's coming off that massive 10-target game where he finished with the walk-off winner. He finished with a 6-catch, 137, and 1 stat line. Diggs is going to be the chalk this week. I think he will be the number 1 owned wideout, but that's chalk that I will be eating, and I'm going to be playing both these guys. Like, what do you think about both?
Yeah, I like it. So Philadelphia's allowed the most fantasy points per game to outside wide receivers, and that is really intriguing because Thielen ran a season low 28% of his routes from the slot last week. I have no idea why that was the case. With Marshawn Lattimore shadowing, you'd think he'd want to get him more looks in the slot and away from Lattimore. That wasn't the case. Diggs has seen far better volume and outproduced Adam Thielen in recent weeks of the last 5 games. Diggs has averaged 0.8 more targets per game and 6.0 fantasy points per game more. Although granted, remember Thielen was drawing one of our top 5 graded cornerbacks in the league, Marshawn Lattimore, last week, so that's going to hurt his numbers a little bit. So the fact that he was running so many more routes from the outside is huge, I think, for Thielen, because Philadelphia is allowing the second fewest fantasy points per game to slot wide receivers. So he would escape Patrick Robinson, and that could also make Jarius Wright interesting in that, he saw 6 targets and 56 yards last week. He runs 80% of his routes in the slot, so if Thielen's bumped outside, he could be one of the better punt play options of the week. Like you said, I think it's a close call between Diggs and Thielen. If you want to roster both, by all means, go ahead. I like both quite a bit. I think Thielen probably is a little bit higher in my projections, but it's close enough to where the value in price difference, I like Diggs a little bit more if I had to choose. And then Wright, again, is another Torrey Smith-like punt play option. Was there anything else you wanted to add on maybe Jarius Wright?
No, I agree that I think he's another punt guy worth looking at. He saw 38 snaps last week. That was the second most snaps he's seen all year. So he must have done something right to get his way onto the field and push Thielen on the outside. Not really sure what, but I think I think Jarius Wright and Torrey Smith are our punt pivot plays if we're dying with a couple of our lineups early in the week.
Maybe Jarius Wright was Pat Shurmur's ace up the sleeve. All right, we have to save him and then unleash him in the playoffs. Our secret weapon. But yeah, interesting to see that shift in usage coming in the postseason. Maybe they identified something in the matchup with New Orleans, though. I don't see how, considering their outside cornerbacks are much better than their slot cornerbacks. I remember, just for Wright, the matchup will be tough if he's in the slot against Patrick Robinson. I do like Kyle Rudolph, and every once in a while I'll be doing my analysis, and I'll think I'll uncover something that no one else really has, and that will give me an edge. The problem is I don't really like this guy too much to begin with, but I do think there's value here, and that's from when Dalvin Cook's suffered the season-ending ACL injury the week after, so week 5 to week 10. Kyle Rudolph averaged 7.6 targets per game. From week 12 to week 17, he was dealing with an ankle injury, saw just 3.3 targets per game. Last week, he was finally off the injury report, back to seeing 8 targets. Saw 8 targets. He's super inefficient. He's averaging 32.9 yards per game this season, embarrassing, especially when considering his target totals. But at the same time, he's found the end zone 5 times over his last 8 games. No one's going to roster him. I think I'm going all in on Gronkowski on FanDuel, but here's another guy you could potentially flex, give yourself a unique lineup. Don't love it, but I do think he's a good volume-based value, and will draw low ownership.
I love it. I think he's a great play for any time you're trying to get in a double tight end stack and try to flex a second tight end. He's a strong play there. We've seen that the Eagles have allowed some big games to opposing tight ends. Travis Kelce went for 8, 103-1. Jordan Reed went for 8, 64-2. Evan Ingram went for 8, 87-0. So I think it's worth trying to get some exposure to him here. He also leads the Vikings in red zone targets. There's just several good reasons to pursue him this week.
Tyler, were there any players or teams you had something to add that you didn't get a chance to mention?
The only thing I think I'd mention is just being aware of ownership this week. We kind of ran through the slate pretty well this week, but I do want to mention being aware of ownership and where other people are going on short slates. I think it's integral to finding your way to the top of a leaderboard. If you can find that 1 to 2% play that nobody else is pursuing, I think it's worth taking a stab at. If you're rolling out 20 lineups or something, maybe throw a shot at Trey Burton. Who knows? Maybe Zach Ertz gets injured and Burton gets thrust into that role right away.
Right. On these 2-game slates, these short slates, really ownership matters quite a bit, more than most weeks. Tyler, I think we did an awesome job in the slate. I think we crushed it. If this was our season finale, I think it rocked. We may come back next week, do the Pro Bowl, Super Bowl DFS podcast for that. Really fun week, basically. If we don't do the podcast, basically mostly fade the Pro Bowl, go heavy on Super Bowl guys. Thank you for tuning in. If you've been listening all season, you're one of our loyal listeners. We love you. If you're new, just checking us out, we love you slightly less. But you can make that up. Like, subscribe, review, retweet, all that stuff really means a lot to me, and I will appreciate it. I'm Scott Barrett, and for Tyler Buecher, signing off, and good luck.